Great. Again, as I mentioned, welcome, welcome, welcome. If this is your first session of the Equity Conference, we appreciate you joining us. If this is your third or fourth, welcome back. We are very excited at the Friday Institute to be able to host and facilitate the North Carolina Conference for Educational Equity. My name is Shayla Rexroad. I am one of the senior research scholars on the Professional Learning and Leading Collaborative team here at the Friday Institute. And it is my two colleagues that I am very proud and honored to work with who had this idea, put it together and said, let's do it. Let's get it out there. So we appreciate your willingness to jump in and be a learner in this process with us and to share your own resources. I am going to be kind of behind the scenes in just a few minutes, but I will be monitoring the chat window. So if you have any technical issues, questions that pop up, please populate those into the chat. I will be taking a look at those. And I will also come back in at the very end of the session in order to provide you with your link for the evaluation, which will then allow you to receive your certificate via email. It will be important that you complete the survey or the evaluation today. It is not something that you will be able to attend a couple of days later and get the certificate, and that's just to ensure those who show up live get their credits. So with no further ado, I'm really excited to introduce Allison Redden, and her topic for today is advancing equity through policy implementation. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Thanks so much, Shayla. I'm so excited to be here. Also kind of nervous, if I'm being completely honest, but I'm very excited to be here to talk about advancing equity through policy implementation. And I'm so glad so many of you have decided to join in this conversation. For those of you who maybe don't know me, again, my name is Allison Redden, and I am a very proud product of North Carolina Public Schools. I grew up in Cabarrus County and then went to UNC Chapel Hill and taught 3rd and 6th grade here in the Triangle area for several years before going back to get my master's in education policy. While I was getting my master's, I worked for the North Carolina State Board of Education and had the supreme honor, honestly, of helping develop the strategic plan that they adopted in August of last year. And currently I work for RTI Center for Education Services. And so to kick things off, I want to, the teacher in me, when I was putting together this presentation, I had an objective that I wanted you all to be able to walk away with. I wanted you to be able at the end of this time together to feel that you are informed about the ways that implementing policies, practices, and programs, how that implementation can ultimately impact equitable outcomes. And so to kick us off, I want to kind of level set with some definitions of equity. The definitions that I'm going to show you here are primarily used in the space of education finance or economics of education, education policy, but I think they're really applicable to what we're talking about more broadly here today. So the first definition is horizontal equity, which basically I kind of think of that as just being everyone gets the same no matter what. So resources should be equally available to any student anywhere. And then there's this other concept called vertical equity that looks at more, there's students who have different educational needs, and depending on those needs, they should maybe receive more resources or something like that. And I think of vertical equity basically meaning everyone gets what they need, right? So whether you're a gifted student, a language learner student, a student with special needs, you get what you need. And that is the definition that I'm primarily going to focus on when I am talking about equity throughout this presentation. I'm also going to try not to talk super quickly, and I'm going to try not to forget a ton of words and things that I've wanted to say, because I am almost 38 weeks pregnant and the pregnancy brain is very real. And so I apologize in advance if I struggle to remember a word or a phrase or something like that, but we are we're doing it. And I'm very grateful to have y'all with me on this journey for the next hour. And so there are three questions or three kind of buckets that I think about when I think about, and I think about them in a research bucket, which is why should we do something? A policy bucket, which I think of as kind of the what should we do based on the research, and then an implementation bucket, which is how we should go about doing it, right? And so in theory, research is telling us, well, why should we care about something like climate change, right? And why should we care that the ozone layer is being depleted? And then policy comes in and says, oh yeah, we should care about that. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we're going to create a policy so that we can eliminate or reduce carbon emissions. Great. Well, then the implementation, the how we should do it is really hard, right? It's very tricky to get people to agree on, well, okay, yeah, we should totally reduce carbon emissions, but how are we going to do that? So the other thing I want to make clear before we move on as well is that we have to understand that policy is not just relegated to what happens in Raleigh, right? So there are these layers of policy. There's the federal layer, which we're not going to talk about at all today, but there's the federal layer. There's the state level. There's a local board level, a school district level. There's a school level. Even that homework policy that you have in your classroom as a classroom teacher is a policy still. And so each of these levels both create policy and implement policy in some way. And like I said, we're going to focus mostly on this implementation piece today. And so the big question, you know, I wrestled a lot with what specifically to talk about for this presentation, because there's so many different ways to go about talking about equity and policy. And that focusing on policy implementation was the most important because, again, like I said, I think it's also the most difficult. So if we know that implementation is the process of executing something or carrying out something, it's that how question. I think it's just the hardest to figure out. And I think it takes the most time to really process and think about. And I think it's better to think about collectively than alone. And so I'm going to throw it back a little bit to one of the classes that I took several years ago. And I think part of what really makes implementation so hard is because people who implement policies, first of all, are human, and humans are not perfect. And also when implementing policy implementers are driven by both these concepts of discretion and autonomy. And so looking at discretion, because educators are faced with these daily, incredibly complex human interactions with students, with other teachers, with parents, with other family members, there is not a set rule or a set protocols for how we can really implement things, even if a policy or program tells us to do something a specific way, right? Educators are so often asked to be both impartial while also being flexible, which I think is just kind of this double-edged sword of impossibility, but that's what is constantly being asked of educators. And so that's kind of what this discretion piece looks like. And then autonomy, on the other hand, is the power that you have as the implementer of policy. And I think when I think about that, I remember when I was in the classroom, I didn't really feel super empowered all the time, but stepping back and realizing that you have power in choosing how to carry out policies is kind of an empowering thing, right? Like you do have power as a policy implementer in your classroom, in your school, in your district. And so I think what gets caught in between these two things of autonomy, which is the power you have, and discretion, which I kind of think about as the pushback that you can give to a policy, what's caught in between in this tension is our personal bias, and every single one of us has personal bias, whether we want to admit it or not. And those biases are often, I think, made evident through the way that we maybe implement a policy or implement a program or a practice. And I think about this with an example of maybe going through a school, like a discipline referral process, right? Do you, as a classroom teacher or school-based personnel, do you write up every single kid who has their phone out every single time, right? Like if there's a school policy that's, no cell phones in school, are every single kid you see with their cell phone out every single time? Or do you use your discretion when adhering to that policy, right? So if you know that this student has a family member who is sick or in the hospital, and they're checking their phone in between classes to see if someone from their family texted them a health update about that person, are you going to write that kid up because the policy says no cell phones? Or are you going to use discretion and say, you know what, I know what's going on in that kid's life, I know that I'm gonna check in with them, I'm gonna have a conversation, I'm gonna make sure everything's okay, and I'm not gonna write that kid up because that's not appropriate, that's not necessary? How do you use your power in following protocol like that, right? So I think it's so important that as we embark on the work of policy implementation at any level, that we have a consistent way to check our biases, that we have a way to confront them regularly. And so again, just level setting with what policy implementation kind of looks like. And there's a quote from a book by Deborah Stone called Policy Paradox. I highly recommend the book. It is very fascinating, just kind of talking about the ins and outs of policy making generally. But the whole premise of her book is that policy is created to either help or harm. And I would even take it a step further and say that not only is policy created to help or harm, but the way that policies are carried out will also either help or harm as well. And so we're going to circle back to this idea of policy helping or harming throughout the presentation. And another thing with this quote or this concept is I want us to consider intention versus impact. And so we can have the very best intentions when implementing a policy, but we also have to step back and think about that impact. So, are we lowering expectations for some students and not others by thinking that we're helping them because we're showing them compassion? Or are we making assumptions about certain groups of students and using our discretion and autonomy in our implementation decisions in a way that may ultimately end up harming them in the long term? Just something to consider and to frame our conversation as we talk more right now about a couple ways to think about equitable policy implementation. So there are three concepts that I think about to drive equitable implementation. And so you're probably familiar at least with the latter two. The first one might be a little newer. So three things that I'm thinking about are policy audits, the use of disaggregated data, and then how we can use focus groups and surveys to ensure equitable implementation. So conducting equity policy audits, I'm really excited to talk to you all about this one today. It's been something I've been thinking about for a long time now, but policy audits can essentially define expectations for equity. They can also make policy a more actionable item. And when I say that, I'm of the belief that policy is not something that should be stagnant. Policy is something that should be reviewed and revised regularly. The way that we implement policies and programs should be reviewed and revised regularly. We know that contexts shift, as evidenced by something like, I don't know, a global pandemic, and the needs of people change. And I, again, am of this school of thought that policy should be for the people, and we have to take that into consideration. And I also policy audits can also work both at a state level and I think a local level. From what I have seen, I have the least amount of tangible, I guess, experience with this, because this is something that is kind of newer to me. But I first learned about policy audits when I was working for the North Carolina State Board of Education. And while we were developing some components of the strategic plan, I came across the equity journey that Maryland as a state had gone through. And I actually presented some of their journey to the state board at their May 2019 meeting. So if you're super interested in the fuller story of Maryland, feel free to check out the archives from the board's May 2019 agenda items. But basically, Maryland had this policy in 2016 about multicultural education and multiculturalism. And then the state board and the State Department of Education said, actually, we want this to be a policy about educational equity, and the multiculturalism component isn't cutting it. So they ended up repealing that policy. And we're going to focus right now, or I'm going to highlight some ways that Maryland has implemented that policy since they adopted it in 2018. So the purpose of the policy, it's like 50 pages long. So I was not going to try to like consolidate all of that on one slide for y'all, but the source is at the bottom if you would like to look it up. But the purpose of that policy was to establish education as a matter of both policy and priority for the state of Maryland and their education institutions. So the policy applies to all of their local school systems, any public agency that provides education services to students from birth to grade 12. And the policy actually has some written in guidance for how to implement or carry out the policy. So each district has to develop their own equity policy and regulation, and that policy has to be reviewed once every 3 years. I do want to acknowledge here too that the context of Maryland is, it's different than North Carolina, right? So this policy that the Maryland Board and State Department of Ed put out had to only trickle down to 24 districts, whereas we know North Carolina has quite, a few more districts than that. We have 115. And so the implementation arcs from the state level to the district level and beyond look a little bit different. But still, the concept of these policy audits happening at the local level every 3 years to check on their equity policy, I think is really powerful. Because of the timeline, we're like, when this policy was adopted in Maryland, we're like coming up right on that 3-year mark in the next year. And so I will be incredibly interested to see how Maryland continues to navigate and guide this equity policy audit process with the rest of the districts in their state. Another thing that Maryland State Department of Education did, I promise this is not like a Maryland fangirl presentation. I'm not going to talk about Maryland this entire time. But another thing that they did was they created additional guidance with their Equity and Excellence Guide. And so basically the guide breaks down several different focus areas that are directly aligned to the Maryland State Department of Ed strategic plan. And this graph that I pulled is from their focus on leadership and human capital. And so in that section of the report, there's this graph that shows the percent of professional staff by race and ethnicity, comparing it to the percent of students in the state by race and ethnicity as well. And then there's this like for each focus area, there is this call out box that actually guides, if you will, people to consider how they can apply an equity lens when looking at this data. There are very clear action steps for both that they list in the guide for both local school districts and also schools. And I think that that level of guidance, I would imagine, is very helpful. And so even taking it a step further away from the State Department of Education, the Maryland Association of Boards of Education created an equity lens card in 2018 for all local boards of education in the state to use when assessing policies, programs, practices, decisions that they're making, or any other type of action that they're making as a board. And I think that these 5 questions can really be used at any level of policy implementation, state, district, even the school level. And I think that the questions also point us back to the concept of, or this overarching theme of policy helping and harming. I would encourage any of y'all to think about these questions when you consider, you know, how you use discretion and autonomy in your own context and beyond. But I just love how the Maryland Association of Boards of Education said, okay, these are our questions. This is how we're gonna filter what policies, programs, et cetera, that we're going to talk about and we're going to pass and implement and share. And so at a school level or even a classroom level, the MidAtlantic Equity Consortium created kind of this rubric or checklist that is in the form of a policy audit that could be used, again, at the school or the classroom level. And I think this checklist format is kind of neat because it can be used in a walkthrough situation if you wanted it to be. I think it can also be used as an unevaluative measure to address equity policy or practice implementation. I also think that just the questions, because they, again, the link is at the bottom of the slide. But the way that the checklist is organized is that there are very clear expectations before you see these questions, right? There are clear expectations for what should be seen, what should be heard, what should be found in classrooms and or schools. I do think that even just using these questions as a jumping off point to talk with staff in schools can be really helpful, especially if this journey of educational equity is new for a lot of people who you work with. And so I want to kind of share some thoughts on, or some questions. I have a lot of questions. Questions are good. But I have a lot of questions about maybe where policy audits could go in North Carolina. And I just also wanted to share a little bit about, you know, things that I've seen, just like, you know, at least coming from the state board in the last year, what that could look like. So if you don't know, the State Board of Education shared their drafted equity resolution at their July board meeting a few weeks ago. And part of that resolution, I highlighted it here, says that the board will review and appropriately revise its policies using an equity lens, which I'm really excited to see and hear. And so just some questions that I know I've been thinking about as I've spent time reading about Maryland's journey, spent time just doing scans of what audits could look like. The first question is just kind of how can the North Carolina board be a leader in developing a policy audit process that maybe local boards could follow or local districts could somehow follow or model after. Another question is what can we in North Carolina, again, across levels, learn from other states or other organizations who maybe already engage in conducting policy audit work. Another question is, how can policy audits even exist across just the educational spectrum, right? So a lot of the examples that I've shared are kind of, K-12 or that birth to 12, like Maryland's policy says is birth to 12, kind of in this K-12 space. But what could that look like, or what could an audit like that look like for higher education? What could an audit like this look like for specific education programming, like gifted programming? And then the last question that I have is just who's going to conduct these audits, right? I want to have us think again back to the framework of discretion and autonomy, and that bias being caught in the tension of those two, because those who are conducting these audits may very well also have different views or biases while they conduct them, or depending on where they're conducting them. And so thinking about how a fair audit could essentially be ensured so that we can objectively address, to the best of our ability, how we're implementing policy and program to ensure equitable outcomes. So the next thing that I want to talk about is analyzing disaggregated data, which I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, probably already do at some level. And so we know that disaggregated data demonstrate a clear picture of how implementation affects specific groups of students and how it affects them differently. We also know that disaggregated data identify gaps across implementation. I don't know if I ever really thought of it that way until I left the classroom. I always thought of looking at disaggregated data as, looking at student proficiency or, academic achievement versus academic growth, and, seeing what that looks like. But as I've stepped back and thought more about what disaggregated is and what it does and how it is helpful to us in making decisions, I have thought a lot more about how looking at disaggregated data can help us figure out where there are gaps in policy implementation too. And I think the last thing is that disaggregated data can also help cultivate buy-in, right? So, I mean, it's easier to believe that there's a problem if the data illustrate that problem. So I have an example here from the Center for Racial Equity in Education, or CREED. They put out their Erasing Inequities report last year that I found to be so informative and so well done. And it disaggregates statewide data from across a wide array of indicators. And this particular example is one that I pulled from the report, and it is just looking at academically and intellectually gifted reading and student demographics who are identified as such. And so feel free to type your responses in the chat box. I apologize in advance that I haven't been able to keep up with the chat box since I'm presenting at the moment, but I asked Shayla if she could send me the chat later so I could read some of your thoughts and responses here. But there are two, I think, very simple yet highly effective questions that are very helpful in assessing the data. And I'm really grateful to people both in my life and on my Twitter feed who ask these questions often. And again, they're simple, yet they're very effective. So what do you notice? And what do you wonder? And so, take a second if you would like to, again, drop some of your noticings and wonderings in the chat box. But I think it's important to use questions like these to help us understand the implementation of something like a gifted policy or gifted education policy, right? Or really, again, any policy or the effectiveness of a program. And so, you know, I'll just kind of share some of the things that I notice and I wonder, in no particular order. But, you know, we see that there are a lot of students who are, you know, a lot of white students are tagged as gifted in reading, and not many other students across other subgroups are. And so do we really believe that white students are inherently better readers than other racial subgroups of students, right? Or how could the implementation of the practice of recommending students for gifted services impact these numbers or impact the students who participate, right? I know I've heard, you know, in the past, I used to teach at a bilingual school, and so we would hear a lot, yeah, well, you know, like, there are just so many parents who just like don't want to be involved, or like who can't be involved. And I think that that's something that you also have to ask these questions of, what do you notice, what do you wonder, where, yeah, it's not really the fact that my, you know, Spanish speaking parents don't want to be involved, but all the communication that you're giving me to send home about this gifted program is in English, and they don't read in English. So how is that equitable? That's the material that you're giving me to give to them, when it's not really fair that that's the information that they're getting, right? What, you know, going back to this data, what can keep these disparities at play, right? Because of continued disproportionality of gifted students, I am sure many of you, if you've been around North Carolina for a while, know that there was a policy passed a few years ago by the General Assembly that stated that students, if they scored a 5 on their math end of grade or end of course assessment, they would be directly placed in an advanced math course. And so implementing that policy at the school level might require several things, right? Like shifts to schedules or teacher reassignment in some cases. But again, I think it's important for us to remember, what's the purpose? Who is the policy helping or harming? And when I look at that policy or think about that policy, I think that the goal is that it helps students who normally would be excluded from gifted programming to have an opportunity to really shine in that space. And so to me, that makes implementation struggle of swapping schedules or trying to, you know, rearrange things worth it, right? But that is just my opinion. And so another example I want to point out is a lot of the work that I've done the last several years outside of the classroom has fallen into this category kind of strategic planning. And so a lot of the strategic planning work that I've been able to be a part of is very much aligned to thinking deeply about implementation of policies, programs, and practices. I wish I could have named this presentation Advancing Equity Through Policy, Program, and Practice Implementation, but it felt a little too wordy, so I just went with policy. But I think you've probably noticed in the last 30 minutes or so that we're talking a lot about policies, programs, and practices here. But this is an example of something I pulled together for a district based on publicly available data. I put together a full-on data report for this district, and this is just one of the tables I put together. I think clearly communicating data and its gaps across subgroups is a really powerful indicator, or can be a powerful indicator, of how well various policies, programs, or practices work. And I again want to go back to these questions. Again, feel free to drop some thoughts in the chat box if you would like. But I want to go back to these same questions of, what do you notice and what do you wonder? And how do these questions help us understand the implementation of something like a school or district-wide discipline policy? So again, in no particular order, just sharing things that I notice and things that I wonder. We see that comparing the percentage of total ISS incidents versus the student demographic percentage looks pretty disproportionate, particularly for Black students and also for white students, but trending in very different directions, right? So questions that I'm now asking are, well, what could lead to these disproportional outcomes with discipline? What are students getting written up for in the first place? What infractions even require ISS? Who is writing students up? Is it the same teacher? Is it, like, there are just so many facets that you can look at to dig deeper, to learn more about what's going on with policy or program or practice implementation here. Again, going back to what this looks like and means in North Carolina, the state board, their equity resolution, again, that they released the draft of in July, notes that all students thrive when equity is grounded in every aspect of the school environment, including, but not limited to, disaggregated and transparent data. And I think this transparent piece is really clutch. So just some questions to think about for what this concept of analyzing and using disaggregated data means for North Carolina is, just thinking about how you in your current context are using disaggregated data to help inform decisions. Another question is, in what ways can North Carolina, again, across levels, so at the state level, district level, and even school level, how can disaggregated data be made more accessible to the public? I think going back to that data communication, that transparency is really, really key here. And then how can disaggregated data be used to paint a clearer picture about the education workforce in the state or institutes for higher education? I think, like I was telling you, or like I was saying earlier, when I was a classroom teacher, whenever I looked at disaggregated data, I just, my brain was very one track mind of, okay, we're just looking at student achievement and student growth. And that's the purpose of disaggregated data. That was like my bubble, right? I was, I last taught 6th grade science. So everything I was looking at was, okay, so these kids, this is where my kids are. This is how I'm, taking that and learning from it. But how can we expand beyond that typical bubble of thinking about disaggregated data solely focused on growth or proficiency and look into other fields within education, right? So with the Institutes for Higher Education, one of the things I'm thinking about is the educator prep dashboard that, is being developed. And I'm curious, and I think the board members have asked questions about this too, listening to many of the board meetings, how is disaggregated data going to be a part of that? And so just interrogating other places where maybe we wouldn't initially think to interrogate to find disaggregated data. And then the last component that I want to talk about here in our time together is one, again, that I think most of you, if not all of you, are probably well aware of. And that is simply surveying stakeholders, getting feedback from families, getting feedback from teachers, getting feedback from principals, getting feedback from community stakeholders. We know that surveys and focus groups allow for very direct feedback from those experiencing the effects of policy implementation. We also know that surveys and focus groups foster open communication and just a general sense, I think, of openness between not only those who are maybe making policy, but those who are implementing policy, and then those who are experiencing the policy, right? So, I mean, that's part of the reason I personally am a huge fan of student feedback and student surveys at the classroom level and school level, and even district level, and even state level, at any level. Because y'all know that if you ask students for feedback, they will give you feedback, whether you want to hear it or not. And so, or whether it's what you want to hear or not. And so surveying stakeholders, I think, gives us this really great opportunity to learn more about kind of how the outside sees the way that we're implementing things, right? We as educators are implementing things. So using surveys and focus groups is, again, like not something brand new that any of you have heard of, but it's another way that we can get access to information that directly influences policy implementation. And it also, you know, even though it's not data that you can necessarily put into a pretty color-coded graph or anything, it's still data. Like, even though it's not quantitative data, focus group and survey data is qualitative, and it gives us an even richer picture of how implementation is or is not working, especially when paired, I think, with the disaggregated quantitative data. I use focus groups a lot, or focus groups and surveys a lot, again, in strategic planning work. So before schools closed because of COVID and everything, I was working with a colleague in a district where we were doing some strategic directly aligned to equity and social emotional learning. And so my colleague and I spent 2 days in this district, like we're talking full days, back to back, 8 to 5, conducting focus groups with so many stakeholder groups, teachers from pretty much almost every school in the district, beginning teachers, pre-K educators, principals and other admin, counselors, central office staff, support staff, right? Bus drivers, instructional assistants. I mean, 2 jam-packed full days of back-to-back focus groups to get feedback so that we could understand and get a clear picture of what equity and SEL look like in that particular district. And so even though my colleague and I, she and I knew the policies that were in place, we knew the district had this definition of equity and this definition of social emotional learning, and we knew what programs that the different schools in the district used, it was absolutely illuminating to hear directly from those who are implementing in the schools, right? So this slide just kind of shows some of the very honest, very real pieces of learning that we received from some of the folks in the district, which ultimately helped us learn more about how to guide conversations about how the district could ensure equity with social emotional learning resources, not just for students like we initially thought when we walked in, but actually for adults, right? So, you know, hearing about that you as a teacher, or as, you know, someone who works in a school building, feel like you're part of this hierarchy or a caste system, that is not, first of all, what you think that you're maybe going to hear when you walk into a focus group or whatever like this. But when you hear things like that, and you're hearing things from people, from educators saying, you know, well, teachers have to be able to recognize their own emotional state. But we're talking, you know, we have so many teachers, like our teacher turnover is high, or we have so many teachers who are getting burnt out. You know, hearing those things, it's like, it makes it very clear, okay, yes, when we talk about strategic planning with this district, we need to talk about the social emotional resources at the schools for students, of course, but we also have to have this conversation about adult social emotional learning too, and what that means and how that can be equitable. And so, you know, even another example, even since the school closures that have happened, another colleague and I are still to this day conducting focus groups with another district. And even though in person isn't possible, conducting virtual focus groups is very much doable. It has yielded very valuable information for us as we continue to do strategic planning work. But it gives us, again, just this clear picture of effective, equitable policy and practice that a district or a school employs. And so thinking about focus groups and surveys in the North Carolina context, the state board has definitely received a lot of feedback on the strategic plan and continues to receive feedback on the plan and its initiatives to ensure that the guiding principles of the strategic plan, which are whole child and equity, can be fully realized. And I know that's something that I really appreciate, that they have offered feedback, or, you know, the opportunity for feedback in that space. And so just a couple questions that I have about focus groups and surveys for our state is, you know, how can conducting focus groups or surveys with those whose voices are often not heard benefit equitable policy implementation? What happens if you decide to do a focus group that is specifically for Spanish-speaking families, and the person conducting that focus group is a Spanish speaker? What kind of information could you gather from that, right? So just thinking about that question, I think is helpful. I think also, how can focus groups or surveys build a collective sense of unity between educators and other stakeholders is a really important question to consider. And then lastly, how can, and I want to make sure I say this right, but how can schools or districts ensure that they're actually using current feedback, right? So they've already done surveys or they've already had focus groups. How can we make sure that folks are using current feedback that they have from families or other stakeholders before they conduct even more focus groups that will basically end up giving them the same feedback, right? Hopefully that makes sense. I'm just thinking, you know, if I participated in a focus group and shared that I have concerns, for example, about, you know, returning to school in person in the fall. Well, you already have, like, you, the district, or you, the school, already have that feedback. What are you going to do with it now? You know, so basically there has to be some kind of plan in place, I think, for gathering, obviously, this qualitative data that's rich and helpful, but there also has to be a plan for, again, implementing, or how we're going to use this feedback. What are we going to do given that we have this feedback? So that's what that question is getting at, which, again, I hope that makes sense. So I want to leave or start wrapping up the presentation right now with kind of a now what, like, now what should we do? We know about these strategies or tools to look at how we're implementing policy or programs or practices in an equitable way. And I just want to say that I am currently taking off my RTI hat right now, and these are 100% like just my opinions and my thoughts as a future parent of a student who will be in Durham Public Schools, a former educator, a current just like generally informed citizen, you know, education and education policy degree holder. Like, these are just some things that I personally have been thinking about. But I really do think that North Carolina should consider, first of all, the benefits of conducting policy audits at state and local levels. I love the way that Maryland went about doing this work, starting at the state level and the state setting an example and trickling down to the local levels. I think North Carolina, if they wanted to, they could go that route. But I also think that if districts wanted to be leaders in this work, if there are specific schools that want to be leaders in this work, then there is nothing stopping you from doing that in theory, right? And which kind of leads to the other thing that I've been thinking a lot about. And I think North Carolina broadly should consider the creation of equity teams to assess equitable implementation of policies, programs, and practices. And I know that there are several districts across the state that, you know, have dedicated district-wide, equity officers or equity teams whose sole responsibility is to ensure equity across their districts. And I think that's so awesome. I mean, I think there are some even that I've looked at who school teams who, coach or work with other teachers in their school on ensuring equitable practice is happening for equitable outcomes for students, right? And so I think those are all really great examples of ways that we can drive this work forward through implementation. These teams could work to create or think about policy audit questions if they wanted to. They could, manage disaggregated data communications. And I mean, there are like a million other things that I think that an equity team could do to benefit this work. I think another thing that North Carolina has to be considerate of is ensuring clear disaggregated data is available across levels for stakeholders to view. And not only do schools and districts, and again, even the state, need to look at disaggregated data regularly to assess maybe how educators might be implementing policy or addressing inequitable academic practices. But the piece that I really want to focus on this bullet is going back to addressing the communication with the greater public here. I think making sure that the data is easy to access and easy to digest is really important, because if I am not, if I am a parent or a caretaker and I have never been a teacher and I have never looked at education data before, we all know in this room that there's a lot of edu-speak that happens. There's a lot of jargon. And, it's super important to make sure that the public knows what they're looking at and understands what they're looking at, right? Do stakeholders know how to interpret that data that they're looking at? Do they know what these different bars mean? Do they know why it's important to even disaggregate data? One of the things that I think about here is also with the, with the North Carolina School Report Card, which I think is a decently user-friendly interface, which I really appreciate, especially as someone who looks at publicly available data a lot. But you have to make the cognitive choice to say, show me subgroup data when you look at a district or the state report card, right? So is it as simple as making on the North Carolina State Report Card, making the default the disaggregated data option, right? So just some things to think about with that. And then the last thing that I think that I would love to see North Carolina really pursue is just engaging in community solution finding through surveys, focus groups, could be through interviews, but just having a community focused solution finding mechanism in place. I'm a firm believer that engaging stakeholders, both those in and outside of education, can lead to a collective understanding of ways to improve our practice as educators, which then translates into how we're implementing policy, how we're implementing programs. And, who better to ask about ways to reach students than students, right? Who better to ask? Who better to ask about how to implement a program, that your school is trying to get off the ground that's related to your local workforce than maybe, I don't know, like local business leaders or a local community college in your area, right? There are so many things that we can learn as educators from outside stakeholders and from inside stakeholders across schools, across districts, even, within your own building across the hallway. And so engaging in some kind of solution finding that gives everyone a voice, I think is something that the state needs to really think about deeply. And so with that, those are just some of the ideas that I think could potentially benefit our state as we embark on this journey of equitable policy implementation. A lot of those suggestions may require an independent third party to support you in doing that work. And if that's the case, please feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions, I think I ended a couple minutes early, so maybe I can do my best to answer some questions right now from the chat box. But I would love to stay connected. And if you have any questions or want to follow up about anything that I shared, please feel free to reach out. My email address is on the screen. You can follow me on Twitter if you tweet. But yeah, thank you so much for coming and
Allison,
listening.
thank you. It was great. Like I said, I will share the chat feed with you because there was a lot of great conversation and comments.
Great.
There was a question early on, and I'm scrolling back up to find it. It was from Amanda Fratnick, and I'm so sorry, Amanda, if I did not pronounce your last name correctly. But she asked a really good question around policy audits. And I know you talked about engaging the community through focus groups and surveys. But her question is a little bit more specific to, has there been any work where policy audits are done by community members, parents, or students? And is there a program where some of these stakeholders can be trained to do this work? Is that something that you're seeing or something that's being discussed right now?
I think that is a really awesome question and is such a beautiful tie-in to what we were just talking about with the, solution finding across community stakeholders. From what I have seen, and I willingly admit that I have not read everything about policy audits that exists out there, but what I've read so far, I have not seen anything about community members being trained to do this. Most of what I've seen is organizations engaging in, or nonprofits engaging in creating audits and then going and conducting those audits. So kind of that third party objective lens. But I think it is a really interesting thought and idea to pull in community members and have them involved in that process as well. So that's kind of an answer.
Yeah, no, it's great. Well, and I think it does help to address where there were some comments from folks in the chat about the need to, and I think you mentioned it as well, the need to better inform and educate parents and family members on how do they advocate for their students. I talk to parents all the time who they didn't even know that AIG testing had happened. They're like, what? I didn't, because their child was not identified, they didn't receive communications about it. So then, as somebody else said, they came into the state, they had missed the dates for testing. So it took them a year of fighting to be able to get them tested again. So yeah, it's a systemic problem of educating, and it's not at all the parents' fault. It's we tend to keep some of this information very close knit, and we assume that parents know this information. But for those, as you said, who are not in education, the edu-talk, the documentation that they are sometimes given is not written in a way that people whose English is a second language or that they can understand it. They can't unpack it. So yes, again, some great conversations happening in the feed. Really quickly, before folks start to drop off, I did want to make sure that everyone saw the link that I posted in the chat for you to provide feedback to Allison. She will receive all of your feedback. Also, at the conclusion, when you hit submit, our team back at headquarters will receive a notice, and you will get an email with your certificate for completion for this session. I also dropped in the chat the link to our YouTube channel, where all of the recorded sessions will be posted following the conference. You will also get a follow-up email with links to that as well, but just wanted to make sure that folks knew that that was out there. And lastly, if you are able to stick around with us until 3:15, our conference host, Tricia Hilliard and Laura Albright, will be leading another end of day reflection, decompression session from 3:15 to 3:45. Yesterday was a huge success. People just really enjoyed kind of the meditation, the opportunity to really unpack all of the heavy learning that we've taken on today. So if you're available and willing to rejoin us at 3:15, that would be great. And if you do need to drop off, thank you again so much. Allison and I will stay out here for just a couple more minutes. If there's anything else that you need or you want to drop some other things into the chat, please feel free. Otherwise, we welcome your feedback and we thank you so much for joining us today.